The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm honoured to follow my colleague, the member for New Westminster Coquitlam, our fisheries critic, on this bill. And I first of all want to commend the member for St. John's South Mount Pearl on bringing forth this private member's bill. I know it was an extremely important part of the reason he ran for Parliament, and also it was part of our party's platform in the last election to call for an inquiry into the Newfoundland and Labrador fishery to talk about what's important here, which is a recovery plan. You know, the story of the Newfoundland fishery can be, the collapse can be pretty simply told. In fact, I want to tell you about a book which outlines some of the major problems. It's called Distant Water, by an individual named William Warner, an American, who wrote it in 1983, and he talked about the three things that came together that caused the initial devastation of this, one of the, if not the, world's most significant source of protein. Because we've got to remember, this fishery, which has been going on for 500 years, fed Europe through many centuries, because the fishery wasn't a local fishery, it was a distant water fishery from Portugal, from Spain, from the Basque Country, from England, and it sustained Europe throughout the many centuries and was one of the most significant protein sources in the entire world. In the 50s and early 60s, three things came together. There was a surplus of tankers, believe it or not, and so shipyards that made big tankers were all of a sudden not very busy. The development of flash freezing techniques took place, and plate freezers were invented and developed. And there was a development of an automatic and mechanical filleting machine by the Germans. Bird's Eye Fisheries had invented the flash freezing technique. All these things came together, and they started the development of a distant water fishery from Europe. The British started it first, then the East Germans, the Russians, and pretty soon we had a huge distant water fleet coming from Spain, from Portugal, from East Germany, from Poland, the Soviet Union, Cuba, and even as far east as Asia. And this fishery was so efficient and so enormously successful that by 1968, and that's the peak year, I think others have mentioned, 800,000 tons of fish, 800,000 metric tons of codfish were taken from the North Atlantic fishery, the northern cod. Distant Waters, the book, 1983. The subtitle is The Fate of the North Atlantic Fishermen. Well, that was in 1983, I wrote about that. By 1992, the catch rate was way down because the fishery could not sustain this. It's estimated that the biomass of fish that was there could actually sustain 400,000 tons per year. 400,000 on an ongoing, sustainable basis. That's the biomass that was there. That's what's been lost, not only to Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada, but to the world in terms of a food source. One of the previous speakers talked about the 12, he said 12 tons. I think he meant 12,000 tons of cod being caught in the last year. I think the annual catch is more closer to 20,000. But that's 20,000 out of a potential of 400,000 pounds. So the question has to be asked, where is the recovery plan? I mean, we've got a recovery plan for the pine marten and for the marmot. Is the marmot, is that what it's called? The British Columbia marmot. Where's the recovery plan for the northern cod, for the cod stock that sustained Europe for centuries and Newfoundland fishermen for 500 years? Where is the recovery plan? 40,000 people and their families lost their jobs and their livelihood in 1992 as a result of the cod moratorium. And you know, to say that, as one, well, they even caught 12,000 tons of cod. Well, you know, and we've got a recovery plan. Well, how are you doing so far? You know, so far with the recovery potential of 400,000 tons, and you're up as far as 12,000 now. I think there's a long way to go. And what we need to know, I mean, the story of how the fishery collapsed is fairly easily told. What's important about this bill is actually Clause 5D, asking, in terms of the terms of reference, to develop recommendations for rebuilding and improving the future sustainability of the fish stock, including as required changes to policies, procedures, etc., and talk about management and boundary, and all of the things that my colleague, the fisheries critic, just so eloquently disclosed. So that's what we need. We need a recovery plan. We need some objective, evidence-based report. We had it from the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans in 2005, talking about fisheries management. The impetus is there. There needs to be some evidence-based approach saying, okay, let's examine the things that the member for Bonavista, Gander, Grand Falls, Windsor talked about in terms of the fact that there seems to be recovery some places. We need to hear from scientists. We need to do a proper job and say, okay, it's not good enough for the Minister of Fisheries, as he did here in the House and elsewhere, talk about the fishery is broken. Well, you don't say the fishery is broken and then walk away from it and leave it to private enterprise or private industry. If we've had this devastation and this loss of a critical food resource for Canada and the world, you've got to do something about it. You've got to say, okay, why are we don't cut back on science if science is needed to answer the questions. You know, I think we've got more than a responsibility to the people and fishermen of Newfoundland and Labrador. We've got a moral responsibility as a country to attempt, if it's possible, to regenerate this fish stock for the sake of helping to feed the world and support the people of rural Newfoundland who've lived for generations and centuries on this resource. You know, the member for St. John's South Mount Pearl, his predecessor, that riding was my neighbour riding. It used to be called St. John's West, and that was the riding that was held by John Crosbie when he was Minister of Fisheries, and the moratorium was brought in 1992. So it's very fitting that the current member for St. John's South Mount Pearl is bringing this 20 years later, saying where is the plan to recover the stock? 20 years later, we're at 5% of what we were 20 years ago. Now the member for St. John's Mount Pearl, the successor to Mr. Crosbie, is here telling the Conservatives again that where is your plan? Don't just say the fishery is broken. Say the fishery has a problem and there's been a failure to adopt a rebuilding plan. We want to have an inquiry to talk about that, just as we did in British Columbia. The Cohen Commission is doing it in British Columbia. You know, one of the members opposite said, well, why would we repeat that on the East Coast? Well, there's nobody going from Newfoundland to BC to talk about salmon in the Fraser River. We want to talk about codfish in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we want someone to do the same kind of study as is being done in British Columbia. The value of that fishery, the sustainability of a cod stock. You know, the member for St. John's South Mount Pearl said, well, look, you know, we've got oil right now, and it's been very good for our economy. It's been very good for the provincial government's coffers. It's been very good for the federal government's coffers. Probably better for the federal government's coffers, frankly, than it's been for the Newfoundland government's coffers. Because when any study will show that the benefits to the federal government are greater than the province. But that may have changed slightly in recent years. But that's not a forever resource. And I see I have 1 minute left. But what we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is examine why, not why the cod fish, because overfishing is the issue. Who did it, when, is not necessarily what we need to get into, but what we need to get into is coming back. I'll just leave you with the fundamental problem with the Newfoundland and Labrador fishery is the lack of fish. That seems pretty basic, Mr. Speaker, and the way to answer that problem is not to say that the fishery is broken, is to say that we need a recovery plan for the species, for the stock, for the sustainability of Newfoundland and Labrador culture and way of life, and for providing, as we should, the restoration of a prime source of protein, of food, for the rest of for Canada and the rest of the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.